Welcome to Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. I'm Daniel Wild from the Institute of Public Affairs. Australia is facing its most significant challenges since World War II. Geopolitical tensions are increasing, cultural self-confidence is in decline. The values which define us, freedom, democracy, egalitarianism, and sacrifice, are being put to the test. Over this special podcast series, Tony and I discuss how Australia can survive and flourish in the decades ahead. Hello Tony, and hello to all of our listeners. It's wonderful to be with you for another episode of Australia's Future with Tony Abbott. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, and there is, as always, much to discuss. We're going to get to something very interesting today, and I'm looking forward to it because Tony is going to be giving us a special insight, behind-the-scenes look at the nature of leaders' debates, what they mean, Tony's experience, and the implications they can have on elections and the broader nature of debate as we head into the federal election later this month. But to begin with, I'd like to start by discussing a big issue that Tony and I have discussed a number of times on this series, which is the policy of net zero emissions by 2050. As our listeners would know, we've discussed the economic and social implications of net zero. But there was also an interesting survey that was published today in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald about Australians' willingness to pay for Australia to cut its emissions. And it's really revealing what the survey found. The survey asked Australians, how much would you personally be willing to pay for Australia to cut its emissions? 39% said they would not pay anything at all. 41% said they would pay, but only a small personal cost. And just 9% said they would pay a significant personal cost. Now, this survey follows a survey that we did at the Institute of Public Affairs last month, where we asked a similar question. We asked, how much would you personally be willing to pay each year for Australia to meet its net zero by 2050 target? And the results were very revealing and support the results that came out today. 42% said they wouldn't pay anything, not one single cent, for Australia to meet 2050 net zero target. 30% said they'd only pay $50 a year. 20% said they'd only pay $100 a year. 5% said they'd pay $500, and just 3% said they would pay more than $500 a year for Australia to meet its net zero emissions by 2050 target. Tony, what does this tell us about the state of the community and the support for net zero that's out there?
It tells us, Dan, that where climate change is an economic issue, the coalition is strong. It's only where climate change is a moral issue that the coalition is weak, which is actually something that I observed back on the night of the 2019 election. One of the things that I found, Dan, was that when it came to enthusiasm for environmental programs, the program that people were most readily excited about was the Green Corps back in the days of the Howard government and the Green Army in the days of my own government, because that was about trying to make a practical difference. It was about getting rid of invasive weeds, getting rid of feral animals. It was about track work in national parks. It was about tree propagation, endangered species and so on. It was about better water quality, about better land management. And this was something that people could see, touch, feel. It was about building a better world today and tomorrow, not just fretting about existential issues decades down the track. But I think that's an indication of where middle Australia is when it comes to environmental issues. We want to protect the planet. We're not so enthusiastic about reducing emissions, particularly if it's going to come at massive economic cost. And the absolute iron law of emissions reduction so far is that it makes power prices much higher, power reliability much less, and I don't think there's really anyone that thinks that less affordable and less reliable power is a good thing. And that's been the practical consequence of all of the policies to produce lower emissions thus far.
look into the future. What I would say, and I'll put this out there for you, and you can make of it what you will. So we did some analysis on what net zero means, and what we concluded is, look, the Greens are actually right. The Greens are actually the only party being honest with the Australian people, because they say, look, net zero is a big deal. If you're going to do this legitimately, you can't have new coal, you can't have new gas, you can't have new oil projects. And they're right.
Unless you're prepared to have nuclear.
Well, unless you're prepared to do that, which we're not. So under current policy settings, they're right, because you can't cut emissions by adding emissions. So we estimated that's going to cost about $274 billion across our economy. So isn't it?
And there are massive swathes of the economy to which emissions are intrinsic. Agriculture, for instance. I mean, you can't run large cattle and sheep herds without substantial emissions. Transport, you can't run heavy trucks without substantial emissions. So it's not just the power sector that's a problem. It's things as basic as agriculture and transport. Then, of course, there's heavy industry. Now, you cannot run a steelworks on intermittent power. You cannot run an aluminium smelter on intermittent power. But no one's proposing that we stop using steel. No one's proposing that we stop using aluminium. All that happens is that we don't produce these things in Australia. We import the products from overseas. The emissions migrate overseas.
So do the jobs.
To places, and the jobs, to places that are much less fastidious about these things than we are. So, look, emissions policy as practiced or as enunciated across the board, but particularly by the Greens, is really an act of economic self-harm for almost zero environmental benefit, because with about 1% of global emissions emanating from Australia, nothing we do is going to make a significant difference. And the really big emitters, particularly China and India, for obvious and understandable reasons, do not want to limit the ability of their people to improve their living standards by damaging the cost structures of their power generation.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned China, and we had some research on that at Point. You say we account for about 1% of global emissions, and another figure we calculated was every 16 days, China emits more than Australia does in one entire year. So if this is a global problem, as we're told, but other nations that are the big emitters aren't acting, then, as you say, there's no discernible benefit for us as a nation. And
look, this whole thing is farcical at many levels. So take the Labor Party's claim that the problems that we've got with the Solomon Islands right now are because of our policy on climate change. Well, if it was climate change that was driving the Solomon Islands, they would hardly be concluding a special arrangement, a special strategic arrangement with the country which is by far the world's biggest emitter.
It's a good insight. Why hasn't that insight been made by others?
Well, I suspect it has, but I'm not sure that it's penetrated the noise of the election campaign.
Right. I want to pick up on a couple of threads of this discussion, and it goes to something you and I have talked about before, which is the role of other civic organisations and business groups in particular. And I found it very interesting, although perhaps not entirely surprising, that the Business Council of Australia has essentially backed in Labor's climate policy. And this is a broader trend that we've seen over recent years of many of the major institutions and the big business groups that are essentially now of the left, whether it's to do with our cultural issues and the woke sort of values that come out of big business and now on the economy and climate. Can you, based on all of your experience as leader of the opposition, as Prime Minister, as prosecuting the case in public on some of these very big issues, what was your experience in your government's relationship with these big industry, big business groups, and how they influence debate?
In my time as opposition leader, the BCO was pretty solid, because back then Tony Shepherd was the president, the head, and Tony Shepherd has had a lot of experience in both the public and the private sector, a very solid citizen who understood that in the end, an important part of the task of government is to try to ensure that the economy runs more effectively, that government is lean and efficient, that regulation is as light as possible, that tax is as low as possible, that the rules have got to be stable and as lacking in burdens as possible. So he well understood this, and Jennifer Westacott was an able chief executive to Tony Shepherd's chairmanship or presidency. Things have changed since then very dramatically, and I assume that this is largely driven by the fact that the BCA is very much the representative body for large public companies. Large public companies have been prone to shareholder activism. They've been driven by the industry super funds, which of course tend to be the commercial arm of the union movement. So you can't rely on public companies and the BCA to give you a serious, hard-headed, commonsensical approach to the economy today.
No, I think that's right, and we've just been doing.
Look, Dan.
Yep.
Look at the campaigns that public companies have championed. They championed not just net zero, but they've championed same-sex marriage. It's a cause that people can agree with or disagree with, but it's hardly at the heart of our economy and of maximising shareholder value. Many of them have championed a constitutionally entrenched voice. I believe that campaign is about to crank up again. Almost inconceivable a generation ago that public companies would en masse get involved in these sorts of things.
Do you reckon we can do anything about it, or is it just something that we kind of have to deal with? Because what we're getting into here is just the big, massive flows of money and international capital that's driving a lot of this. And I think a lot of the reason I ask this is just we've been in North Queensland last week talking about net zero in communities from Cairns down to Gladstone, and you get the feeling that a lot of people feel pretty disempowered and pretty let down, whether it's their local politicians. What do you reckon the average person can do about this?
Dan, again, the only way to respond to all of this is to become more active. I know how busy people are. I know how hard it is for lots of families to make ends meet. And the last thing people want to do is go to meetings, ring up talkback radio, get active on social media, join the political party of their choice and try to make it better. But as I've often said, a majority that stays silent does not long remain a majority. People who are not prepared to speak their mind have got to accept that noisy alternatives will prevail. And if private business is to flourish, if strong communities are to prosper, and if our country is to remain strong and cohesive, the people who are in favour of business and who are in favour of our neighbourhoods and their qualities and characteristics and who want our country to be proud, we've got to speak up more.
I think that's right. And it's just to build on your point, it's not just that a majority that's silent won't be a majority. It's that they start to believe that they're the minority. If you're not seeing your views or values reflected back to you, you start to believe that few other people think as you do.
And it's never really upset me that much to stand up in whatever context it might be and advocate a view that I believe in and that I think there are persuasive arguments for. But I'm probably a bit unusual in being like that, Dan.
But more often than not, it was revealed that if not a majority, a significant minority were with you.
Look, on climate change, there is no doubt that where the coalition has been prepared to fight for a sensible position that wants to reduce emissions, but without massive costs, without driving industries offshore, without sacrificing tens of thousands of jobs, we win and we win well. Look at the 2010 election where we fought a government with a big majority to minority status, the 2013 election where we had a thumping win, the 2019 election where we campaigned strongly against Labor's jobs-destroying, indeed economy-wrecking emissions position.
Yeah, indeed. No, that's a very good way of putting it. And I think it's a good position for us to go on to our next topic, which is the nature of debate in our democracy, and one particular facet of that, which is the leaders' debates. There was the first debate between Morrison and Albanese a couple of weeks ago, and there's two more debates that are slated, one on Channel 7, one on Channel 9 over the coming week and a half. You've had a lot of experience in public debate in various forms, and you were very successful in your leaders' debates that you had in your time as opposition leader and your time in politics. What I'm interested in to begin with, and what I think our audience would appreciate, is firstly a little bit of, behind the scenes insights into how did you personally prepare? Did you sort of have a pretend opponent that would pretend to be who you were facing? How did you psychologically prepare? What did you do? Did you go for a run? Did you do some exercise? How did you get fired up for it?
The best way to succeed in debates is to create low expectations beforehand, Dan. And I was always pretty good at creating low expectations. Look, the debates are very important because the public want to look at their leaders and potential leaders and feel that they've got a good sense of their strengths and that they can cope with any weaknesses. And I guess they want to feel that they've got a handle on their leaders and would-be leaders, and they like to think that whoever they vote for is someone who, on balance, they think is a reasonable human being who's going to do a reasonable job. So these debates certainly are important. I used to try to ensure that as far as was humanly possible, I didn't get too hung up about these debates, knowing that John Howard was regarded as the loser of almost every leaders' debate he ever went into, and yet had an outstanding record at winning elections. So I tried not to get too hung up about them. I tried not to do much more than simply maintain the broad positions that I'd had through the elections. The interesting thing about debates is that where you've got members of the public, you often get left field questions because the preoccupations of the public are not the same as the preoccupations of the Canberra bubble. And this is why I think those town hall style debates that Sky has been running have actually been better in showing a different side of our leaders than the ones that the media dominate via the press club or the more traditional journalist format. I certainly tried not to over-prepare. I mean, every day is a debate between yourself and the public that you interact with, the media that you interact with, and election campaigns are basically one rolling, often combative, sometimes genial, but they're a rolling conversation between you and the Australian people in all their various guises. So you're pretty well prepared by everything you've done up till that point for the debate itself. The important thing is not to get too nervous. And for me, that meant being as well-versed as I could be in the likely questions, getting Andrew Hurst and Peter Credlin and Andrew Stone and others on my team to throw me what they think were the most difficult questions and to tell me how they thought my responses measured up. But trying to make sure that you're in as good a frame of mind as you could be before the thing, and that often meant going for a run or a trip to the gym.
Do you have a most memorable debate moment, good, bad, indifferent, that you can share?
Probably the most significant thing to come out of any of my debates was the Brisbane Sky News Town Hall Forum versus Kevin Rudd in 2013. And it wasn't what actually happened there in the forum. It was what happened beforehand. The same person did the makeup for both of us. And afterwards, she was quite nice about me, but not very nice about Kevin, who presumably had been a bit distracted and indifferent when he went in to the makeup room, I was apparently quite relaxed and chatty. When I was a journalist a long, long time ago, they said never be rude to the copy boy because the copy boy or copy person might be your editor one day. And I guess the same applies to the people who you come across in retail, the people you come across in public transport, and the people you come across in makeup rooms.
No, I can certainly imagine. I certainly imagine that situation with Kevin in the makeup room. When just to finish off this thread of conversation, so when we're looking at the next couple of debates, do you reckon that they are going to have any real impact on the final outcome of the election? I mean, my instinct is, look, they can have an impact if one of the Morrison or Albanese really stuff something up, if they really have a gaffe or they get something seriously wrong. Maybe Albanese forgets a stat again or something like that. But my instinct is, look, most people probably have made up their mind, and you sort of have to you have to disabuse them of their notion that they have. What do you reckon? Look,
I've never gone into an election at any time in my life undecided about my vote. I've made up my mind a long time before the election, and I guess being a political animal, I find it hard to understand why people haven't made up their mind. I can understand people changing their mind, absolutely, but I find it difficult to grasp people not having made up their mind. Yet we're told that up to 10% of people make up their mind as they're walking into the polling booth, which is one of the reasons why these debates do matter. I think that undecided voters make up their mind very much on the basis of the vibe. And that's partly what do they think or which party or leader is going to do best for them. Are my health bills going to be a little bit lower under one side than the other? Are my wages going to be a little bit higher under one side than the other? Is my mortgage repayment going to be a little bit more manageable under one side or the other? And then a sense of which leader comes across as more authentic or more fair income, to use the Australian vernacular. So these debates certainly do matter. Is the leader on top of the policy? And is the leader a decent human being? It didn't happen in a debate, but I think one of the most significant moments in the 2004 election was Mark Latham's so-called assault handshake against John Howard, because he was a much larger, younger bloke, seeming to be aggressive against an older, smaller person. And I think that turned a lot of people off. Latham, as you might remember, looked like a winner going into the 2004 election, but in the end, it was the strongest result for the coalition since 1996. Didn't mean that the coalition was invincible, as we discovered just 3 years later. But look, speaking as someone who led the coalition through 2 election campaigns, for the participants as much as for the observers, election campaigns tend to be a fog. So much happens. It's hard to remember anything in particular, and yet every so often something stands out, like that handshake between Howard and Latham. Like for me, that exchange with the makeup person prior to the 2013 debate.
No, Tony, thank you for that really interesting insight into behind the scenes of the leaders' debates, and thank you for your insights and analysis of net zero and the business community and the challenges we face as a nation. So I'm looking forward to picking up some of these discussions over the coming weeks. But for today, we'll have to leave it there. So Tony, as always, thank you for your insights and your time, and I'm looking forward to our future discussions.
Thanks, Dan. Me too.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.